We're going to wrap up our series that we've been going along for the past number of weeks. And if you're just kind of gathering with us here this morning, it's been a series that has essentially looked at the reality of how does our faith live out in the day-to-day. With this important understanding that the way in which we live is never an attempt to earn God's love or to impress God with what we do. But rather all of life, all the choices we make, all the decisions, all the actions, the way in which we live is a means of a response to the love and the grace that God has already given to us. And I think this is significant for us to understand that life is not lived in an attempt to earn God's favor, but that we choose out of God's great love for us to then give all of life back as a response in the day-to-day. In the moment by moment. And so you kind of draw to the conclusion then that if this is the reality, then because of God's love, we begin to see a transformation. We begin to see a reality beginning to take root in our lives so that faith and so that God is not simply someone we talk about, but that a reality, a lifestyle that we live. And so I've continued to come back to this important point, this understanding that faith is then not private. It's not something that's just between God and I, but that it becomes public in the sense that it's everything that we do. Now by that I mean faith isn't obnoxious, it isn't over the top, it isn't in people's face, but rather what it becomes is a window into the reality of God's love for others. And that's why I've set up, hopefully, the helpful analogy of the fact that people are window shopping for Jesus. People don't simply want to hear about God. They want to see the difference, the reality that it makes in our lives. And so we've looked at some of the various virtues that God desires become a part and just a reality in our life. As to how does faith impact my emotions? My places of when I'm incredibly angry. How does my faith impact elements of self-control so that when I am tempted, I don't give in? How does my faith impact my view of possessions and material things, particularly in such a consumeristic culture? Like, how does faith become real and practical and a reality in our life? And so that it becomes real for us, but it also becomes real for others as well. And so today we're going to kind of circle back to the very first week. And I'm not sure if you remember, but we focused on the reality of because of our faith in Jesus, how do we begin to see that ever shy, that ever fleeting virtue of humility begin to form? How do we get away from pride, which is a big problem because we become overconsumed with ourselves? And this morning we're going to look at what I kind of refer to as pride's ugly stepsister, right? If pride is focusing and being consumed too much upon ourselves, then pride's ugly stepsister is that of envy. When we focus and become overly consumed on the things that other people have that maybe we don't. And so what is envy? I think sometimes our culture, in my own life, we tend to round the corners a little bit. And we think, oh, well, I'm just being envious or I'm just being jealous. I think jealousy gets us into the doorway, into the room of envy, but it's not the same. You see, jealousy is when I see something that you have that I sort of wish that I had as well. But I don't really think ill of you because you have it and I don't. I just really, really wish I had it, right? That's kind of essentially jealousy. Envy is where you get to that place of realizing not only do you have something that I want, but it actually saddens me a little bit that you have it and I don't. And as a result, I start to resent you for having what I do not have. Many, many years ago, one of the early church fathers, Thomas Aquinas, a guy way, way smarter than me, put it this way, that envy is essentially being unhappy at another person's happiness. And so there's this sense of being saddened, about being disappointed. And this can cover so many elements of life, whether it's someone's success, whether it's their abilities, their gifts, their achievements. It may be their situation in life. Maybe you become envious of their family or their relationship or their accomplishments or their material possessions. And it pushes you beyond just jealousy into a sense of being unhappy. And when pushed even further, envy goes to a place where suddenly we actually think ill of the other person. We may even do things to, in an attempt, bring them down a notch so that maybe in their unhappiness we'll start to feel a little bit better about ourselves. The Apostle Paul, when he was talking to a bunch of Christians in Rome, gave this incredible verse where he says, you know what? As followers of Jesus, we need to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Envy flips it around. We don't rejoice when people rejoice. We're actually saddened by it. And we don't mourn when people mourn, but if we're envious of someone's situation, there may be actually even a little bit of celebration when things don't go as well for them. See, envy is so much more than just jealousy. There's an incredible amount of ugliness within it. And as you read through the Bible, you see time and time again, when people seem to slip up and fall the most, oftentimes it's because the seed of envy has been planted. Very early on, when God was building his community, when Moses was giving leadership, God gave to Moses the 10 Commandments. And most of us are familiar, maybe not with all of the 10 Commandments, we can probably riddle off a few, but we're understanding the principle behind them. And in one of them, God says to Moses, do not covet, right? Because coveting can lead to envy. And what I love about this, it's as if God is saying, okay, we're going to get really specific about this, Moses. I'm going to tell you, do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's spouse. Do not cover, and you got to think, okay, we're going to need more than 2 tablets for this, God. Like, we need to get this moving here. But don't covet his spouse. Don't cover his house. Don't covet his servants. And then it's almost as if God is like, okay, let's just make this really straight. Don't covet anything that someone else has. And this is when God is building his community. He understands the danger and the poison that envy can bring, not only into other people's lives, but how it can poison your own soul as well. So there's a number of places that we could turn to in the Bible to just see this reality played out. But this morning we're going to turn to the Old Testament, to a man by the name of Saul. And you may be familiar with Saul a little bit, but Saul was the very first king of Israel. And we're told that Saul was an impressive young man. He was far superior, and he stood out among everyone in Israel. So he was essentially top dog. And things went fairly well for Saul at the beginning of his kingship, at the beginning of his leadership. He had successful victories and triumph. Saul was known as being the guy in all of Israel. But as you begin to dig a little deeper, you say that there were significant things that Saul was struggling with. A sense of jealousy, a sense of insecurity, which kind of blows your mind because you think Saul had it all. What would he possibly be jealous about? But envy and jealousy knows no socioeconomic reality. It can begin to get in and begin to work at us in unbelievable ways. But I believe the biggest downfall for Saul is the fact that over time you start to see that he was failing to walk with God. Saul began to think that he could figure things out on his own. Right around the same time as Saul, there was another rising star in the nation of Israel. His name was David. Now, David was rather insignificant early on. He was a shepherd boy. And David comes onto the scene at the time in Israel's history where Israel was fighting the Philistines. And normally, you would have army against army, but the Philistines thought, we have a different idea. We have this massive guy on our side named Goliath. He was huge. And so Goliath would come out every day, and he would stand on the plains, and he would stand before the nation of Israel and say, basically, bring your best guy out. Your best guy and I will have it out, and whoever wins, wins. Let's just settle it, one-on-one. And Israel's like, no way. I'm not stepping out against this guy. And so day after day, Goliath comes out and starts taunting the Israelites. Well, David, this little shepherd boy, is bringing basically bread and cheese to the front line, bringing supplies to help people out, and he hears what's going on. He's thinking, why isn't someone stepping forward? And so David says, okay, I will do it. And when we sort of know the rest of the story, David goes out and defeats Goliath. Well, suddenly, the tables begin to turn. Saul sees David as this up-and-coming star, and he wants him as his right-hand guy. But then things begin to change for Saul. And so that's kind of the context in which we're jumping into the passage here this morning. As Saul and David and others are now returning to Jerusalem, and we begin to hear what is said. So I invite Peter to come up and read that passage for us this morning.
The lesson this morning is from 1 Samuel, chapter 18, verses 1 to 16. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people, and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs, and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get now but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns.
And so there we see the situation. Saul and David are returning home, and there's this massive parade. A place where they are celebrating their victory. And what was being said at the parade was incredibly upsetting to Saul. This is my brief paraphrase of what was being said. Essentially, the crowds were shouting out, "Saul is awesome, but David is awesomer." I'm not sure if awesomer is the right word, but we're going to run with it here this morning. And they kept singing it over and over and over again. And all that could ring in Saul's ears was not, "Hey, the people think I'm pretty awesome, I'm a pretty good king." It's, "David is awesomer." And he was angry. And it bugged him. And he began to have the evil eye placed upon him. And it's here we begin to see how jealousy led Saul down the path of envy. Because it wasn't just that Saul wanted what David had. He didn't want David to have it anymore. And he took matters literally into his own hands, not once but twice, by throwing a spear at David and trying to pin him to the wall. Now, we read that very quickly, Saul kind of gave David control and sent him out of town. But eventually it became so bad that David saw the writing on the wall, that he understood that Saul wanted him put to death. So David had to flee. And he could not return until ultimately Saul died. It's interesting as you continue to read the situation, the story with Saul, you see that his life ended tragically, completely out of his mind, taking his own life. And I would be hard to convince that it was anything other than the reality of what envy was doing to him. How it began to consume him. That regardless of how successful Saul was, he couldn't get out of his mind that here was David, someone who was loved by the people, and envy brought him to a place of wanting to take it from David as well. In the passage we just read, we come across one of those troubling verses in the Bible. One of those verses that as a speaker oftentimes you want to just kind of gloss over and move quickly and kind of get to another point. But it's there, so we need to deal with it. And the problem is as jealousy is beginning to set in, we read this verse in verse 10 that says, "An evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul." Did anyone see that? Anyone read that? I thought so. I figured as much. So I'd talk about it here this morning. And so what does that mean? We may step back and think, well, wait a second here. Maybe Saul isn't to be blamed for the actions that he took. I mean, after all, is this what God sent upon him? In some of the reading that I've done, it's talked about how oftentimes in Hebrew, the original language of Scripture is a very figurative language. And that in this instance, it wasn't so much that it was God doing the sending, but rather God allowing and permitting this to take place. When pushed a little bit further, you see that the actual word evil is translated in different ways. Some would say unhappy, some would say bad, some would say injurious. And so I've come to the conclusion, or my understanding is the fact that likely this was an emotional state that Saul was experiencing in his life. And so what does it mean? There's a verse later on that says that the Lord had stepped away from Saul. Remember earlier I mentioned the fact that Saul was stepping further and further away from God. He was failing to follow in the ways of the Lord. And so what I believe was happening in this instance was that God was allowing Saul to go down the path that his heart ultimately wanted to go. In the same way that when we deal with temptation, or we deal with other emotions that we experience in our lives, that if we fail to follow in the ways of God, God is ultimately, out of his love, going to allow us to go down the path that we choose to walk. And so what I believe is happening here is that God is allowing, God is permitting Saul to act upon the desires of his heart. Envy's beginning to seep in, which for me is incredibly troubling, because I begin to realize at what is at stake is that when I fail to follow in the ways of God, when I fail to put my focus and attention upon him, I am making myself vulnerable. I am opening myself up for attacks that will come upon me and will enable me to act in ways that God would never desire me to respond in the first place. And so here is Saul, because of his inability to follow in the ways of God, wanting to bring harm upon another, but ultimately bringing harm upon himself. And so what's our response? How do we respond in those situations where, if I'm being honest, and I'm sure if you're being honest, we realize the reality of jealousy in our life? How do we not allow jealousy to bring us down the path and enter the room of envy and bring greater destruction into our lives? I think the first place is to be honest and to admit that this is a challenge. This is a problem. You see, as followers of Jesus, we're not called to say, you know what, I've got it all figured out. I have no problems. I have no difficulties. Jealousy, no, not I. I'm a Christian. I'm not jealous of you. Meanwhile, you're plotting ways of, I just wish I could knock him down a peg sort of thing, right? I think what being a follower of Jesus says is, you know what? I struggle with these as much as the next person. And so I'm desperate for God to work in my life so that I can overcome. Because Saul had so much. He had it all figured out, yet envy took it all from him. What I find interesting about the situation with Saul is just how subtle envy truly works, of how it begins to twist jealousy. Because notice, Saul wasn't jealous of David's good looks. He wasn't jealous of David's ability to play musical instruments. He actually enjoyed it and thought it was great. He was jealous at what brought him a sense of identity and worth in his life. Oftentimes, envy works in the places of life that threaten our greatest abilities and treasures. Let me give you an example from my own life. When I hear Chuck play the piano, and when I hear and see what he's able to do with that instrument, I'm jealous of his abilities. I wish I could play as he could play, but I don't begrudge Chuck for that ability. I don't start to resent Chuck because he can play and I can't play. But bring in someone who is a gifted speaker, a gifted communicator, and envy begins to circle. And suddenly I'm not only jealous of the person's ability to communicate, I begin to compare. I begin to think, are they thinking so-and-so is awesome, but so-and-so is awesomer? And it eats at me. I often wonder if one of the great challenges that churches face is the sin of envy. I hear so many people who don't go to church, typically top of the list is, well, why would I go to a place? I mean, you all can't seem to get along anyways. You're always kind of fighting and complaining about this church is doing that and church B down the street is doing that. And I wonder, so often we may put up this deck of cards of saying, well, you know, it's because of differences of belief and whatnot. But I wonder if the real reality is envy is seeping in the doors of the church. Because we see church A down the street as growing faster than our church. or is having a ministry that maybe we don't have, or is being more successful than us. And so what do? It's almost like envy gets the better of us, and so we don't throw arrows at them or spears at them, but we throw words. We try to take them down a notch, as opposed to being able to do what Paul says: rejoice with those who rejoice. Celebrate the building of the kingdom of God. And so one practice that I have in my life is to make sure that I do not speak ill of another church. I may disagree with certain things that they hold on to, but to promote and to celebrate the realities of what God is doing in building his kingdom in other churches. And so if you're just kind of kicking the tires on this church here today, let me tell you, if this doesn't work, there's other great churches in our community that would be happy to have you. Great ministers, great people doing incredible things that we need to celebrate, because the kingdom of God is bigger than this place. And so we need to celebrate what's going on. And so maybe for us, we need to be able to identify those areas in our life that envy can so easily slip in. Whether it's success at job, whether it's gifts and abilities, whether it's family, whether it's someone's situation, to come alongside and to honestly be able to say, I want to celebrate with you. And so what's the antidote to envy? Kindness. And when I say kindness, I mean more than just being nicey nice. More than just being nice when it's of benefit to ourselves. Kindness really kicks into gear when you find yourself in a situation where you see jealousy beginning to ramp up. Kindness begins to kick into gear when you're honestly able to celebrate and rejoice with others. Kindness says, not only will I pray about the envy in my life, but I'll pray for those that I'm envious of. It works. Pray for people that you're envious of, and God begins to do an incredible work in your life. But the greatest counter to envy is, again, to focus upon Jesus. You see, Saul's downfall was he started to walk further and further away from God. And so he stepped into envy. When our focus and attention is more upon the things that God has done for us and the things that God is still going to do, as Charles Spurgeon once said, suddenly we don't covet the things of this earth, because we know that God has a much greater plan for us. God has so many greater things in store for us. And so when we pursue God, when we pursue these things of greater substance, suddenly the things that used to bring jealousy and envy begin to lose their hold upon us. People are window shopping for Jesus. People want to see the reality of God at work in our life. I talked with the kids about these pumpkin seeds. And the question comes back: what are we planting in our lives? Because God clearly tells us, you will reap what you sow. You will reap what you sow. Now, I know very little about gardening, but I know if I keep these seeds in the bag, nothing's gonna happen. I got to begin to plant them into the earth. In the very same way as we see this reality of God desiring to be at work in our lives, to simply hear it, to admire it, to want to do it, but to fail to respond is like keeping the seeds in the bag. God desires to make a great work in our lives. God desires to use us to make a great work in this world in which we live in. But we can't keep them in the bag. We got to allow him to be at work in our life. And so kindness is a first step, is the reality of seeing God at work in my life in such a way so that unlike envy that wants to bring about resentment and destruction, kindness brings about celebration and joy and the building of God's kingdom here on earth. So let our focus be upon Christ, not only for our benefit, but for the benefit in the world in which we live. Please stand with me.